good afternoon, good morning, or good evening. This is Team 2 consisting of
Adriana Dio,
Lisa Guido,
Gregory Hamilton,
Joshua Talamayan,
and Nick Marshall. And we are very excited to share with you our presentation entitled The Failure of Cyberpunk 2077 and the Fall of CD Projekt Red. By way of introduction, it must be acknowledged that video games, despite their ludic origins, are now serious business. While mobile gaming, think Candy Crush Saga, takes up a large portion of the overall video game market, the combined total revenue of console and PC games in 2020 was still a respectable $73 billion. And to put that number in perspective, that's over 6 times Hollywood's total box office revenue in 2018, pre-pandemic. While independent developers and their personally driven works of art still exist on the periphery, the money has, for the most part, agglomerated around so-called AAA gaming studios and their intellectual properties. This presentation explores and analyzes the mistakes of one of those studios. On December 10th, 2020, Cyberpunk 2077, a highly anticipated AAA video game developed by the Polish-based studio CD Projekt Red, was released to widespread acclaim. Within 72 hours, that acclaim had soured as it was revealed the game was riddled with bugs and graphical errors, especially on last-generation consoles like the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. In response to the bugs, some of which made the game unplayable, customers demanded refunds. The demands crashed Sony's PlayStation Store. Subsequently, in an unprecedented move, Sony withdrew the game from its store. CD Projekt Red's stock dropped 29% during Cyberpunk's initial launch and ultimately fell by 41%. Investors sued the studio in 2 class action lawsuits to recover damages from the misleading statements made by CD Projekt Red. Their chief complaint was that the company had failed to disclose that the game was essentially unplayable on previous generation consoles due to the abundance of bugs.
So why did this happen? In the course of our research, we managed to find evidence of problems on all 3 sides of the Iron Triangle: scope, resources, and scheduling. Permeating these problems, however, were certain fundamental issues of culture and cognitive bias. We will address each of these in turn.
With regard to scope, Cyberpunk 2077 was nothing if not an extremely ambitious game. CD Projekt Red sought to capitalize off the success of their previous game, The Witcher 3, a game released to almost universal acclaim in the difficult and cutthroat market of the modern video game industry. The Witcher 3 went on to win Game of the Year in 2017. With immense success from its predecessor in The Witcher 3, CD Projekt Red aimed to capitalize on the hype that The Witcher 3 generated with the upcoming release of Cyberpunk 2077. In CD Projekt Red's ambition, Cyberpunk 2077 was to include a myriad of systems, objects, branching narratives, a huge open world, flying cars, and organic day and night cycles. Every non-player character was to have his or her own list of personal tasks that they would execute throughout the day. Non-player characters would remember interactions with the player and behave accordingly, and all of these mechanics would have to function together perfectly. As one could tell, the scope of Cyberpunk 27 was large and had many ambitions. To power these ambitions, CD Projekt Red chose to flirt with danger by developing its own physics engine. Many games, even AAA titles, are developed off pre-existing assets and engines, software that describes the physical simulations required for a video game. The choice to develop a whole new engine while potentially allowing for optimization was an unnecessary hurdle. Aside from its gaming scope, Cyberpunk also had a vast marketing scope. The game was to be released on the latest gaming consoles, the Microsoft Xbox X Series and PlayStation 5, as well as all the previous generation consoles. To be marketable, the game would have to run very well on the legacy systems, as on the latest and greatest hardware. In a Q3 earnings conference call a month before the game was released, CEO Adam Kaczynski said the game is running great on every platform, a claim that later proved to be false.
Cyberpunk 2077 was one of the most expensive games ever developed with a total cost of $321 million. Although Cyberpunk had such a hefty price tag, only $121 million were used toward game development. CD Projekt Red, prior to the development of The Witcher, had been a small team of about 15 people. But the large scope of its ambitions demanded a larger team, and so by the end of the development of Cyberpunk, CD Projekt Red had added 500 members, including a group of 18 developers who were onboarded 6 years at the initial start of the project, dangerously flirting with Brooks Law. Aside from raw development costs, CD Projekt Red invested heavily in marketing, spending of about $200 million for Cyberpunk 2077, resulting in 2/3 of the total costs. Among other grandiose costs, CD Projekt Red booked multiple celebrities, including Grimes, A$AP Rocky, and the star of their 2019 E3 promotional event, Keanu Reeves, who also provided the voice and form for a pivotal character in the game.
In order for any project to flourish, the organizational setting, specifically the culture, matters. In 2016, CD Projekt Red underwent large organizational change. Adam Badowski, who was originally the head of the art of the original Witcher, took over as the director of CDPR. Though he assisted with project momentum, he demanded significant fundamental changes to the scope of the ultimate video game implementation. He specifically required a shift from third person's perspective to first person's perspective. These scope changes not only reset project development, but caused cultural clashes between Badowski and top developers. These top developers had strong opinions about Cyberpunk development, being that they had worked on Witcher 3. The continuous opposition with Badowski caused several resignations of these high-level employees. Cyberpunk also hired experts from the US and Western Europe, which created cultural barriers. When interacting with non-Polish speakers, developers were instructed to speak English but rarely followed the rules. These cultural and language barriers further heightened the issues faced by CD Projekt Red. Aside from those issues, CDPR's job descriptions focused on the cool factor of working at the studio and failed to provide statements about teamwork or delivering top quality products and services, and most importantly, they failed to address quality assurance testing. Instead, the company indulged in the increasingly common test with release culture, where games would be released even if there were bugs to be patched up later. This practice was widely known to be introduced by Minecraft back in 2010 and solidified into the gaming industry by Fortnite in 2017. The culture of CDPR, by all accounts, was and probably still is marred by hubris. Undeniably, the CDPR team had instances of optimism bias and overall feelings of invincibility. When asked lessons learned from The Witcher 3, then director Konrad Tomaszkiewicz said, "We had a huge game and launched it simultaneously for all major platforms. For us, that experience is the most important learning we'll be taking with us to Cyberpunk 2077 and wherever the future takes us." This particular quote seems to demonstrate that the CDPR team is not a team interested in lessons learned, but rather in boldly declaring the inherent value of hard work. They seem to think that any obstacle can be overcome with sheer brute force and confidence. Journalists, retrospectively analyzing the founders of CDPR, conclude that they are impulsive and imaginative, but are often unable to actually fulfill goals they set. CDPR executives continually evince an attitude of invincibility. These executives were overly focused on optimistic outcomes and had unchecked ambition, which led to poor planning and overall ineffective project management. Rather than focusing on risk management processes through Cyberpunk's development, executives would respond to engineering concerns about Cyberpunk's complexity with phrases such as, "We're the studio that made The Witcher 3. It'll work out," and "We'll figure it out along the way."
Project scheduling is a complex process and is the backbone of successful project management. When done correctly, resources are aligned and properly utilized. Processes flow according to plan and costs stay on budget. When done incorrectly, even small delays can spiral into major impacts to the overall project. It's unclear whether CDPR used traditional or agile project management for Cyberpunk, but for fans, one of the most obvious and apparent failures, aside from the bugs, were its scheduling problems. CD Projekt Red missed the mark when scheduling development and release for Cyberpunk 2077. To put it in perspective, this game was released 7 years after the initial announcement, whereas typically games take about 3 to 5 years to complete. There were 3 main reasons why project scheduling failed for Cyberpunk: underestimation of game complexity, not allocating time to sufficiently test on all game platforms, and lack of external testing resources. As you can see from the quote on the slide, one of the programmers at CDPR alluded to the fact that management did not have a solid plan of execution that tied to their release date. Management itself admitted to investors that it underestimated the development work that would be required for this complex game. This underestimation resulted in numerous delays, and eventually the developers were forced into a crunch, which means they worked nights and weekends in order to meet the deadline, and 6-day weeks for over a year. This adds significant cost to a project since most of the costs are in the time people are working versus any cost of materials. Another reason for the delays were due to the different experience the players had when the game was played on different consoles. In this case, some of the older consoles were not able to process the high-tech graphics, which caused glitches in the game. This was clearly not contemplated during project scheduling and highlights the issue of not understanding the scope up front. Finally, due to COVID, the company was unable to have testers at external locations test the game. As we know, resource constraints can have a direct bearing on project outcome. The only testers they had were internal and were provided equipment to test by the company. So any issues with consoles or any other gameplay issues that would arise from testing in a non-controlled environment were found late in the process and led to further delays. Next, we'll take you through some ideas we had to make this project less of a failure.
It's easy and a bit disingenuous to point out a company's failings in retrospect and act as an armchair CEO. Nevertheless, we feel there are 4 main changes CD Projekt Red could have implemented to prevent the colossal failure of Cyberpunk 2077. First, CDPR should have limited scope by making a decision as to what gaming engine they were designing for. CDPR should have learned from the mistakes of planning with The Witcher 3 instead of taking those lessons as an excuse to delay and overscope Cyberpunk. CDPR since spent 2/3 of their budget on marketing. We suggest that money could have been better spent on development. And finally, CDPR management should have listened to the engineers that pointed out the difficulties in the complex nature of this project undertaking, instead of glossing over those concerns with bravado and confidence. Cyberpunk 2077 is only the latest in a series of buggy releases of video games. Gamers previously had been tolerant of buggy releases of other AAA titles, but with Cyberpunk, fans expressed new levels of dissatisfaction, and the consequences have been detrimental to CD Projekt Red's reputation. It is incumbent on future project managers working in the gaming industry to learn from these mistakes, and it is probable that other industries can learn from them as well. We hope this has been informative, and we look forward to your feedback. Thank you for your time.